Well, today is Saturday. It is May the 13th, 2023, and my joy to come with today's Heart of a Shepherd devotional, the title, The Lord Demands Justice. Now, our scripture reading is two chapters, Deuteronomy chapter 19 and chapter 20. Well, Moses' challenge to Israel return to the subject of the cities designated as cities of refuge in chapter 19 and verses 1 through 13. Now, after defining the boundaries of the tribes, Israel established three cities of refuge on each side of the Jordan. For what reason? That every slayer, every man killer may flee thither. Now realize there was a difference in the matter of killing as there is even in our day. There was murder, which was the intentional taking of an innocent life, and then there was manslaughter, that unintentional taking of a life. Well, notice then Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verses 2 through 13, where we do have a total of 6 cities of refuge that are mentioned. These were all Levite cities, as I've already noted in chapter 19 and verse 4. You have the ones that killeth his neighbor ignorantly, whom he hated not in time past, so that's manslaughter. And then the other is the intentional killing, murder, that is described and mentioned in verse 11. Now, verse 5, we're given an example of an accidental killing and prove the necessity of cities of refuge to be far from one another in the land, that people might flee out of the tribes there until their matter was heard by the elders of the city. You find that in verse 6 and verse 10. Of course, we're reminded as you look at verses 11 through 13 that a city of refuge was not to give sanctuary to a murderer. And so when a man was found to be guilty, he was put out of the city. And then we come to Deuteronomy 19 and verse 14. Here we have the matter of a man's property, his inheritance. And we have really what would be established as removing not the ancient landmarks. Now, once land ownership was established, the borders of that property were marked either by natural boundaries, such as maybe the flowing of a river or a creek, or by a column of rock and stone that would mark the corners of a man's land. Well, because a man's land was how he supported his family, it was a severe offense for a thief to move a marker, a landmark, and thereby encroach upon the land of another. And then again, going back to the court system, Deuteronomy 19 and 15 through 19, here we have 2 or 3 witnesses that were required to convict. Now, the Lord required Israel to take any allegations of wrongdoing seriously. Now, as you look at verse 15, no man can be convicted of an offense without his sin being established by 2 witnesses or even at the mouth of 3 witnesses. And so in verse 16, you'll notice it was a serious matter when a man brought a false witness against another. We would call that today perjury. Now, we'll notice in verses 18 through 19 that the priests and judges would weigh the testimony, the witnesses. And after diligently inquiring, should a man be guilty of bearing false witness, he could and would be punished with the punishment of the crime of that which he had accused another man falsely. Wonderful example of justice and fairness. Now, also in verse 21, the law was summed up in this: life shall go for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for a hand, foot for foot. So it was a serious matter to falsely accuse someone else. Now that brings us to Deuteronomy chapter 20. Now in Deuteronomy 20 verses 1 through 4, again remembering this is all preparation for the invasion of Canaan, we're given the instructions for going to war. Now, we see the earnestness of knowing that as Israel went into the Canaan, into the promised land, it would necessitate years of battle. And Moses challenged them on behalf of the Lord, don't be afraid of your enemies. Now, the men of Israel were to go to war. Their courage came from not their expertise on the battlefield, but from believing God. For we read, he is the same one who brought them out of Egypt. Surely he could be the one that would give them the land. And so they were to prepare themselves for battle. And the priest before the battle was to speak to the people. And I'm going to read verses 3 and 4 and remind them of this. Deuteronomy 20, 3 and 4. Hear, O Israel, ye approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint, fear not, do not tremble, neither be ye terrified because of them, your enemy. For the Lord your God is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. What an incredible promise of encouragement that would be for Israel, as that nation often faced enemies far greater in number than themselves. But there is also Deuteronomy 20, verse 5 through 9. We're reminded once again of God's graciousness. For here we have some that would be exempted from enlistment. So notice then verse 5 through 8. To go to war then would require that a man be fully committed to the cause. Why? Because distractions in the heat of battle could be disastrous not only to the man's life but to his fellow soldiers. Therefore, Moses lays out on behalf of the Lord 4 groups of men that were exempted, at least temporarily, from military service in Israel. The first is in verse 5. A man who had built a new house but not dedicated it was allowed to return to his house. Why? Because his house would have been on his mind, on his thoughts, providing for his family. Verse 6, a man who planted a vineyard but not yet eaten of it. In other words, the vineyard wasn't mature yet. Therefore, that man could go home and take care of that business. Now, you'll notice in verse 7, should a man be betrothed but not yet taken her to wife, he could return to his house. Of course, a man going to battle and not yet consummated his relationship with the woman to whom he was betrothed, his mind, his thoughts, his emotions would be upon her and not upon the battle. And then finally we come to verse 8, recognizing the disastrous influence of fear amid the battle. We read in verse 8 that a man who was fearful and faint-hearted would be allowed to go and return into his house, lest his brother's heart faint as well as his heart. In other words, a man filled with fear could be contagious to other men, and so his lack of faith bring about ultimately the defeat of Israel, that such a man would be sent home. And then we see some instructions also regarding the laying a siege to a city, and particularly how this might be done. First of all, Israel was to offer peace if that city would pay a tribute for them. Now, this was a city that was very far off, would not be in the heart and the core of Canaan. However, should that city reject the terms of peace, we read in verse 14, every man of the city was to be slain, but the women, the little ones, and the cattle would be spared as spoil for Israel. Now, verse 18, the nations that dwelled in the land, we see them enumerated here, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, they were all to be destroyed. Why? Lest the heathen teach God's people to do after their abominations, their wickedness, their idolatry. Now, the land was then the inheritance of God's people. And therefore, we read that the Lord required the army, now watch this to see God's grace, spare the fruit trees when laying siege to a city. Cut down other trees and use it to build bulwarks against a city that you are attacking in war. But spare the fruit trees. Why? Because they would be the food, or the meat, as it says here, of God's people. Well, I have a closing thought for you today. And it is, I hope that you've noticed that in this matter of God's law and commandments, we always see His grace and His favor. The judicial system for Israel was just, and therefore no one was to rush to judgment. But desiring truth, anyone that was a false witness, anyone that distorted the law and justice with a false testimony would be punished with the crime or the punishment of the crime for which he falsely accused another. That's a great point to remember, how much God demands truth. Now I close with this, Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. What doth the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with thy God? Thank you for joining me for today's Heart of a Shepherd devotional. Just a reminder, if you go to myheartofashepherd.com, you'll see at the end of today's devotion 4 questions to consider to invite you to dig a little deeper in our study. God bless you, and thank you for being a part of this Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.